when the telegram reached Detective Inspector Harriet Vane at her Sussex cottage. The sun was just beginning to lean westward, casting long amber streaks across the polished wood of her study. The message was crisp and urgent, bearing the seal of the Northumberland Constabulary. Murder at Greystone Manor. Locked room. No suspect. Request your presence immediately. It was signed by Chief Constable Everard Holmwood, a name that hadn't graced Harriet's memory in years not since a particularly messy poisoning case in Cambridge. She folded the telegram, slipped it into her coat pocket, and by nightfall was on the northbound train. Greystone Manor sat like a brooding sentinel on a windswept cliff overlooking the North Sea. The house, constructed of heavy slate and granite, had a reputation in the village of Elmbrook for misfortune. People muttered about cursed land and buried guilt, though most of those stories were as faded as the wallpaper in the drawing room. Harriet arrived just past noon the next day. Holmwood met her at the gate with a strained nod and the pinched expression of a man already anticipating disappointment. "The victim is Dr. Edwin Mercar," he said without preamble. 59, retired pathologist, widowed. Lived here alone except for a housekeeper and occasional visits from his niece, Miss Lydia Mercar. He was found yesterday morning in the library door locked from the inside. Windows bolted, dead. Cause, a knife wound, straight to the heart. Harriet raised an eyebrow. A pathologist killed by a knife. Poetic. Holmwood didn't smile. He led her inside, where the scent of wax polish mingled uneasily with something coppery and faintly sweet. The library was large, panelled in oak, with high windows looking out onto the storm-beaten cliffs. A green leather armchair faced the hearth. Dr. Morker's body had been found slumped there, as though dozing until the housekeeper, Mrs. Trellis, discovered the blood. Harriet examined the room meticulously. There was no sign of forced entry, no secret passage behind the bookcases, and only one key to the door which had been inside Morker's waistcoat pocket. The murder weapon, a slender stiletto-like blade, had been left on the carpet, wiped clean of prints. There were no muddy footprints, no displaced items, nothing, save a single curious anomaly. On the mantel stood a small stone figurine, an ancient Egyptian Ashabdi, commonly placed in tombs as a servant for the afterlife. Odd in any household, but less so in one owned by a former medical man with an interest in death. "What do you make of this?" she asked, tilting it in the light. Holmwood frowned. "We assumed it was his. The room's been untouched, but the housekeeper swears it was never there before." Harriet set it back carefully. "Then we must assume it's a message." She interviewed Mrs. Trellis first, a plain woman with nervous hands and a devout belief in routine. She had been with Dr. Mercar for 6 years. He was a quiet man, she said, didn't like visitors, always locked the library when he was working. Working on what? Wrote articles for some medical journal, kept a lot of anatomy books, and Lydia comes once a month, sometimes more. Nice girl, but the doctor wasn't fond of her. Thought she was after his money. Was she? A shrug. She didn't act it. But people have secrets. The niece arrived the following morning, tall, well-spoken, in her mid-20s, with ash-blonde hair and a distant manner. Harriet met her in the drawing room, where Lydia stood at the window as if contemplating a fall. "I suppose you think I did it," she said calmly. "Should I? I don't particularly care. My uncle hated everyone, including me, but he paid for my education, so I smiled through it." Harriet sat opposite. "Did he have any enemies?" "A few. Other doctors. A patient's widow once threatened to sue, but that was years ago." "Did he receive visitors recently?" "Not that I know of, except..." She hesitated. "There was a man last week. I don't know his name. He was tall, foreign, I think accented voice, wore a blue cravat. I found it in the hall after he left." Harriet requested the cravat. It was expensive silk, monogrammed with the initials RM. No one in the village matched. Holmwood's men traced it to a London tailor, and from there, to a Romanian antiquities dealer named Radu Moldovan, currently staying at the Crown Hotel in Alnwick. He was summoned for questioning. Moldovan appeared impeccably dressed and entirely unruffled. "Yes, I visited Dr. Mercar," he admitted, "to discuss a purchase. He had in his possession a rare funerary figurine, 3rd intermediate period, circa 1000 BC. He offered it to me for evaluation. The Ashabdi, exactly. He claimed it was authentic. It was not a modern forgery. I declined the deal. Was the meeting cordial as fraud allows? I left and thought nothing more of it. Did he threaten you? Only with embarrassment. I don't kill over insults, Miss Vane. Back at the manor, Harriet turned once more to the figurine. Something about its base troubled her. She examined it under a magnifying glass. The hieroglyphs were genuine in form, but subtly off, one glyph inverted, another misshapen, not a message, but a code. She jotted down the symbols, cross-referenced them with a medical text in Morker's collection, and found a match. It was a chemical compound, curare, a paralytic agent, and suddenly, the impossibility unraveled. Morker hadn't been stabbed while alive. He had been paralyzed, slumped in his chair, unable to move, and then stabbed after. The locked room trick wasn't in the entry, it was in the timing. The killer had administered the poison in advance, perhaps in his brandy, then returned hours later when the paralysis had taken hold and finished the deed. She re-interviewed the housekeeper. Did he drink alone the night before? No. Miss Lydia had a glass with him. Then she left. I remember because the brandy decanter was low. Harriet turned to the glassware. 3 glasses had been cleaned but only 2 used. The third had a faint trace of lip rouge on the rim, Lydia's lipstick. Harriet summoned her. You stayed longer than you claimed. Lydia's smile was thin. I was angry. He said he was changing his will again, cutting me out. I went back to confront him, but he was already half asleep. I poured him another drink. I left before midnight and left the door unlocked. She paused. Yes, which explained the return. The killer came later, once the paralysis was certain, used the knife, and relocked the door with the key taken from his pocket afterward. But you didn't kill him. Harriet said, you administered the poison. Without realizing, Lydia blinked. What? Your glass and his both had curare. Someone else added it before your toast. Someone who knew the symptoms wouldn't appear until hours later. Mrs. Trellis was arrested the following day. In her room, hidden behind loose floorboards, were several letters between her and a man named Rupert Glassmarker's former colleague. Disgraced after a scandal involving patient deaths, Morker had exposed him. Trellis was his cousin. Revenge had festered quietly for years. It had taken time, but she had infiltrated Morker's household, earned his trust, and when the Ashabti glasses gift arrived, she knew it was time. She poisoned the brandy, watched Lydia pour it, and waited. She entered later, knife in hand, and stabbed a man who could neither scream nor resist. The locked room mystery was solved not by force, but by foresight. As dusk fell on Greystone Manor, and the last of the constables departed, Harriet stood at the edge of the cliffs. The shadows stretched long across the land, and the wind carried only the cry of gulls and the cold sigh of the sea. Another case closed not with drama, but with quiet, surgical precision. Like a scalpel in a pathologist's hand. It was 2 days later when Lord Peter Wimsey arrived unannounced, underdressed, and smiling faintly as if he were about to gatecrash a country picnic, rather than step into the heart of a murder investigation. Harriet Vane met him at the front hall, arms crossed, chin slightly raised. I didn't summon you, she said, though not unkindly. No, my dear, said Peter, shedding his overcoat and gloves with theatrical ease. But you did wire Holmwood, and Holmwood wired Sir Gilbert St. Croft, and Sir Gilbert is my cousin on the mother's side by a rather tangled route involving an elopement, and 2 invalid wills. You know how the St. Crofts are about protocol. One murdered doctor in the family's backyard, and they start making lists. Harriet gave a dry smile and turned toward the drawing room. Well, if you're here, you may as well be useful. The room had not changed since the first day. Polished surfaces, clean carpets. No sense of intrusion except perhaps the faint echo left behind by the man who had died here. Wimsey paused just inside the threshold and tilted his head like a man, listening to faint music. He stepped toward the hearth and stared at the Ashabdi on the mantel. That, I suppose, he murmured, is our ghost. Harriet watched him carefully. The housekeeper introduced it into the scene. Her motive was clear: revenge on behalf of her cousin. The poison was in the brandy. She stabbed him after paralysis set in. Yes, textbook. Really, calculated, clinical, a performance for one. He turned back, eyes bright behind his pince-nez, but something doesn't quite hum in harmony, such as? Whimsy took out a silk handkerchief and used it to lift the Ashabdi, holding it at arm's length like an old artifact in a museum. It's weighted at the base deliberately, heavier than it looks. It would topple the moment you set it upright, on anything uneven, which means it was placed with precision, an offering, a warning, or simply a theatrical touch to ensure it would be found. He replaced it delicately. Also, he added, pacing, you said Trellis wiped the knife clean of fingerprints, but left it beside the body, correct? Well, said Peter, adjusting a cufflink. That's dreadfully sloppy, isn't it? She's precise enough to time a toxin to paralyze. But then stage is the murder scene like a penny dreadful. It doesn't scan. Either she's a genius or she's not. Harriet frowned. She might have wanted the knife found. A message, yes. But to whom? Certainly not to you or the police. Perhaps to Miss Lydia. They found Lydia in the conservatory, where she was trimming the dead leaves off a potted camellia with unnecessary violence. She looked up as the two approached. Another detective, she said dryly. Peter bowed. Only part-time. When I'm not rescuing heiresses from kidnappers or retrieving missing rubies from vicarage tea tins. Lydia's mouth quirked. So what now? Another round of questions. I've told everything I know. Have you? Peter sat on a nearby bench and folded his hands. You said your uncle threatened to change his will, out of curiosity. Did he ever mention the name Rupert Glass to you? Lydia went still. Once, years ago. Said he was a fraud. A butcher who called himself a healer. Did he mention how they parted ways? He reported him, I think. Something about forged credentials and mistreatment of a patient. It was before my time. Why? Because your housekeeper is Glass's cousin. Lydia blinked. That's not possible. Mrs. Trellis was with him for years, and perhaps earning her keep in more ways than one, said Harriet quietly. She was in place long before the Ashabdi arrived, long before Moldovan. Whimsy looked up at Lydia. Do you recall any unusual visitors over the past few months? Not just Moldovan. Anyone your uncle might have seen in secret? No, he rarely went out. Once a week to church, and even that he'd stopped. But she hesitated. Yes, there was one man, in March, I think. He didn't come to the door, he waited outside the gate. I saw them talking from the upstairs window. He wore a long coat and a hat. Uncle looked furious. Did you hear anything? Just one word, shouted, traitor. Peter stood slowly. Well, perhaps the past isn't quite so dead as Dr. Mercar assumed. Later that evening, while Harriet pored over Morker's journals, Whimsy wandered back into the library alone. The storm outside rattled the windows faintly, and the fire had long since turned to embers. He crouched by the hearth, not at the Ashabdi, but at the rug where the knife had been found. He lifted a corner. Something crinkled. He drew it out, a receipt. Half-burnt. Only part of the ink remained, but he could read enough. London Euston. To Elmwick, March 4th. Passenger, R. Glass, curious. He murmured. If Trellis acted alone. Why hide this? It proves nothing unless she wasn't supposed to be involved. Unless someone else was watching. He returned to Harriet, holding the scrap. This changes the tempo, he said. Harriet read the receipt and looked up sharply. Glass was here himself. Yes, and if he had seen Mercar in March and intended revenge, then Trellis may not have been his handmaid, but merely his key. The question is, did she carry out the act, or was she framed to seem as though she had? Harriet stared into the fire. There's one way to be certain. We go back to the night of the murder, step by step, and as the shadows lengthened across Greystone's aging walls once more, the illusion of resolution began to unravel, thread by thread. They began the next morning with Mrs. Trellis, now in custody but still self-possessed. She sat upright in the interrogation room at the local constabulary, hands folded as if awaiting a sermon rather than a cross-examination. Harriet watched her carefully, noting the calm, almost distant detachment. Whimsy, perched on the edge of the table, regarded her as if she were an antique of questionable provenance. We found a receipt. Harriet began. For a train journey, Rupert Glass, March 4th. Elmwick, Mrs. Trellis did not blink. I don't know anything about it, no doubt, but it places your cousin in Elmbrook weeks before the murder, which begs the question, was he the one orchestrating events, and you merely the stagehand? I had nothing to do with Rupert's visit. He never came to the house. If he had spoken to Dr. Mercar, it wasn't through me. But you killed him, Whimsy said. Gently, I did. Then why hide the receipt beneath the carpet? Harriet asked. Why burn it at all? This time, there was a flicker in her composure, a faint contraction at the corner of her left eye. I didn't hide it. Then someone did, Whimsy said softly. Someone who wanted the trail to lead to you, but not too quickly, just enough evidence to make it neat. Double quotes. Mrs. Trellis said nothing. Her silence, Harriet thought, was to clean like polished glass over a crack. Back at Greystone, Harriet called in Lydia once again. The niece entered briskly, her expression sharpened. By sleeplessness, I heard about the receipt, she said without preamble. So did half the village. Harriet replied. Small towns don't keep secrets long. Are you saying she didn't do it? We're saying she may not have done it alone. Lydia's mouth tightened. Then find the other one. I've told you everything. Perhaps, Whimsy interjected, but perhaps in the wrong order. You told us you saw your uncle with a man outside the gate in March shouting, traitor. Then, days before his death, a foreigner comes offering to buy a fake relic. Your uncle changes his will, and you pour him a drink laced with curare. I didn't know it was poisoned. Did you taste it yourself? Lydia hesitated. No. Yet you drank brandy with him often, yes. But that night, only he drank. I didn't say that. No, Harriet cut in. You said you had a glass. But we found no traces of poison in the second glass. Only his. Lydia's shoulders stiffened. He poured it, she said at last. Not me. He poured 2 glasses. And I left mine unfinished. Then you touched only your glass? I believe so. Harriet stepped forward. And yet there were fingerprints your uncle's on both glasses. Not just the one he drank from. Whimsy tilted his head. On habit, touching both glasses, unless you poured. Or unless someone else set the scene afterward. Lydia's composure cracked barely. I don't know what you want me to say. The truth will do. Whimsy said lightly, if inconvenient, even better. Later that afternoon, the detectives turned their attention to Moldovan, the antiquities dealer. He agreed to a second meeting, this time in the parlor of the Crown Hotel, seated beside a carved griffin and a half-finished tea service. I already told you, he said, waving a long hand. I came for the Ashabdi. It was fake. End of story. You told us you refused the deal. Yet Mercar told his housekeeper he had sold the piece. He lied. To save face, perhaps. Did you pay him? Harriet asked. Moldovan pursed his lips. A small consultation fee. But I left the statue. Harriet exchanged a glance with Whimsy. But the statue didn't come from his usual sources. It wasn't listed in any of his estate papers. He wasn't a collector. No evidence of other artifacts in his study. That Ashabdi came from someone else. Moldovan's eyes narrowed. I don't know who gave it to him. Perhaps Rupert Glass, Whimsy asked, almost casually. The silence that followed was too long. Moldovan sighed. I met Glass once, years ago. He tried to sell me a funerary mask with a forged provenance. I walked away, that's all, and yet you didn't mention it before, because it has no bearing. I'm not involved in your murder. Then, perhaps you'd care to explain why your name appears in the notes of Dr. Morker's final journal. Harriet said, drawing out a page. Right here, Moldovan returned. Threatened exposure. Moldovan's gaze dropped. That wasn't about the Ashabdi. It was about Glass. Mercar thought I was acting as an intermediary. I wasn't. I came to warn him that Glass was in England again, that he was asking questions, and the statue, I don't know. Perhaps it was a gift, or a warning. Either way, I wanted no part of it. As they left the hotel, Whimsy looked thoughtful. He's lying, he said, but not about everything. I think he did warn Mercar, and I think he regrets coming back. A second time. You noticed that too, Harriet said. When we first questioned him, he said he hadn't returned. Now he admits he did. They all lie, Whimsy murmured. The guilty ones, the innocent ones. They lie to make the story neater, to cast themselves in better light. But real truth is messy, like blood on a carpet. That evening they sat in the library again, fire flickering low. Trellis's confession is real, Harriet said, but it lacks heat. There's no venom in it. She sounds like someone taking the blame for a failed operation. She might have acted out of loyalty. Whimsy mused, or fear, or perhaps she was promised something. What about Lydia? Lydia's hiding something, he said. But I don't believe she killed her uncle. Not with a knife. She's clever, but not cruel. There's something else, some pressure. Something she won't name. Harriet stood, moved to the mantel, and stared at the Ashabdi again. What if the statue wasn't a message? She said slowly. What if it was bait? For whom? For us. And in that moment, the shadows in the room seemed to shift. The pieces hadn't aligned yet, but somewhere among the voices, the contradictions, the too eager confessions and evasive truths, someone had slipped. Not loudly, not foolishly, but just enough. And once you heard that slip, you could never unhear it. The fire crackled low in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the library walls as Harriet paced slowly across the rug where the body had once lain. Whimsy sat in the leather armchair, now carefully not in mimicry of Morker's final position, but near enough to study the angles of the room. The faint scent of old brandy still lingered in the air, mingling with wax polish and something faintly metallic, like a memory of blood. He was pulling too many threads, Harriet said at last. Glass, Moldovan, even Lydia. It's as if he'd begun to sense that someone was circling him. Or more than one, Whimsy replied. The longer I stare into this business, the more I think we're looking at overlapping motives, not one clean crime, but several tangled desires all rushing toward the same end. Harriet turned. Let's try to untangle them, then. Start with glass, motive, revenge. Whimsy nodded. Clear. Mercard destroyed his career. Glass had reason, time, and from the receipt, opportunity. But he's still nowhere to be found. If he was the architect, he left someone else to execute the plan. Trellis, Harriet said. But she confesses too easily, Whimsy murmured. That's what troubles me. She accepts guilt like someone accepting a train ticket without complaint, without embellishment. It's tidy, too tidy. And then there's Lydia. Family tension, Harriet said. Money, but she doesn't strike me as mercenary. She resented him, yes, but she doesn't lie well. She withholds. Whimsy tapped a finger against his knee. She didn't know about the will. She said she didn't, but her story cracked when we asked about the glasses. That tells me she was here longer than she admits. Perhaps even saw something or someone that night. Harriet crossed to the writing desk and pulled open a drawer. It had been locked before, but now the contents lay bare. Old correspondence, half-used notebooks, a letter opener shaped like a scalpel, and at the very back, a folded page creased, yellowed, unsigned. She laid it flat on the desk. Read this, she said. Wimsey stood, leaned over. The handwriting was tight, cramped, but the words were clear. If you don't stop the articles, I'll come myself. You were warned. The Ashabdi was a gift once. You've turned it into a threat. Now you'll see what's buried doesn't always stay dead. Whimsy read it twice. Well, our Egyptian trinket wasn't just stage dressing. This came before Moldovan's visit, perhaps before glass. Returned, Harriet nodded. A warning, but veiled, the tones too polished for Trellis. Not emotional enough for Lydia. Moldovan? Possibly. But I suspect there's someone else, someone in the middle of this web. The Reverend. Whimsy said suddenly. Harriet blinked. What, Reverend Holdan? He visited Mercard weekly. They played chess, exchanged letters. He even spoke at the man's funeral, too peripheral to notice, too quiet. But he knew Mercard well, and he knows everyone in this village. That's thin. It's not nothing. He has access. No one would question a visit from the vicar, especially at night. And he turned, eyes narrowing. The Ashabdi. It would have come from someone who knew Mercard had a fascination with ancient burial customs. Harriet raised a brow. You're suggesting the vicar plotted a murder with a fake Egyptian relic as his calling card? I'm suggesting he might know more than he's said, and I think it's time we asked. they found Reverend Holden tending roses behind the vicarage, his hands muddy and his expression somber. He greeted them with subdued warmth and led them into his study, where the air smelled of paper, lavender, and pipe tobacco. Dr. Mercar was a troubled man, he said, after the initial pleasantries, but he had a sharp mind and a generous heart when he wasn't on the defensive. I miss him. Were you aware he was writing about Rupert Glass? Harriet asked. The Reverend hesitated. Yes, he told me. He said the world had forgotten the danger that man posed. He was trying to publish a final expose. Did you support that decision? Holden sat back. I advised caution, not because I doubted his claims, but because Mercar had grown paranoid. He saw enemies in every silence, every misstep. He thought even Lydia was conspiring against him. Was she? No. She loved him in her way, but she wanted to live, not linger under his scrutiny. And the Ashabdi, the Reverend's eyes flicked to Harriet's. Strange, isn't it? He said. Mercar showed it to me once, weeks ago. Said it had arrived anonymously, no note. Just a box at his doorstep. He called it his ghost. Thought it meant Glass was nearby. Did you ever see Glass? No. Did you ever speak to Moldovan? I met him briefly, at Morker's request. Mercar wanted me present in case things became uncivil. But Moldovan was calm, businesslike, said the statue was fake, that Mercar was playing at secrets. They parted poorly. Did you believe Mercar was being watched? Whimsy asked. The Reverend hesitated again, longer this time. Yes, he said finally, though I don't believe it was Glass or Moldovan. I think someone close to him wanted him afraid. Afraid enough to change his will, afraid enough to lash out. Someone who benefited from his panic. Whimsy stood. Thank you, Reverend. You've been more helpful than you realize. Back outside, Harriet turned to him. You believe him? I do, Whimsy said. But I also believe he's sitting on something. Not lies, just omissions. Guilt, perhaps, for not doing more. They returned to Greystone as the wind picked up along the cliffs, biting and sharp. The house felt different now, less a scene of a crime, more a puzzle box slowly revealing its edges. Harriet looked again at the will, the revised one, signed a week before the murder. Lydia's share reduced, a large bequest to a medical trust, and oddly, £10,000 left to TB, initials with no clarification. She frowned. Whimsy. Does Trellis have a middle name? Bethany. I believe. Why? TB. He took the will from her, scanned it again, then nodded slowly. She knew she was getting something, he murmured. It wasn't about Glass. It was about money. She was promised it. And the only way to guarantee that sum, especially if Mercar changed his mind again, was to act fast. And the person who knew about the bequest, who might have urged her forward. Harriet's voice was low. Lydia. Whimsy's eyes sharpened. She stood to lose. But if Trellis gained 10,000 and she gave Lydia half, greed, Harriet whispered, dressed as grief and a neat little confession, to shield them both. The web was tightening now, threads crossing in a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The time for theory was ending. It was time for confrontation. The storm that had been gathering off the Northumberland coast finally broke the next morning. Rain swept across Greystone's slate roof in hissing sheets, the gray sea behind it churning, like something with a mind of its own. Inside the manor, a different sort of tempest had begun. At first light, Constable Holmwood had arrived at the doorstep, face flushed with the thrill of discovery. He held a brown envelope in his gloved hand, sealed and stamped from a forensic lab in Newcastle. We've got it, he announced without waiting for an invitation. Clear prints on the blade, partial but distinct, belonged to Rupert Glass. It's over. Harriet, who had risen early to re-examine Morker's final notebook entries, met him in the hallway. Whimsy emerged from the library moments later, drying his hands with a handkerchief on the knife. Harriet asked carefully. Holmwood nodded, triumphant. Near the hilt, smudged, but enough to make a match. The lab double-checked. It's him. Whimsy took the envelope and turned it over once, then handed it back without opening it. When were these prints collected? 2 days after the murder. And no one handled the knife before then? It was bagged at the scene. Trellis didn't wear gloves, but we already had her prints. Hers weren't on the blade. Harriet's brow creased. But we searched the house. No signs Glass had been inside. No one saw him, and we assumed Trellis acted alone. Well, now we know she didn't, Holmwood said. He must have come after Lydia left. Trellis let him in. Whimsy's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked windows. That makes an odd choreography. Glass travels across the country, hides from all notice, somehow enters a locked manor without any of the neighbors seeing, commits the murder, and leaves again without a single footprint in the mud. He was clever, or invisible. Holmwood bristled, but Harriet spoke before he could defend his theory further. We'll need a warrant, she said. If Glass left the country, he might already be beyond our reach. He didn't, Holmwood replied. Interpol flagged a bank transaction in Durham. He withdrew £500 2 days ago, and you're going after him? We've already traced him to a boarding house near Newcastle. He's being arrested as we speak. With that, Holmwood turned, rain slamming the door behind him as he disappeared into the storm. Silence returned to the manor like a held breath. Well, Whimsy said, retreating to the warmth of the fire. That's that, isn't it? Harriet didn't answer. He looked over. You don't believe it either? No. He nodded slowly. Good. I was worried we were slipping. She sat across from him, the notebook open in her lap. There's something wrong. If Glass had time to plant the Ashabdi, poison the brandy, and stab Mercaral while remaining unseen, why would he leave his prints? Only his prints, indeed, Whimsy said. And on the blade, no less, when the knife was wiped clean. It suggests one of two things. Either Glass was careless and likely for a man living in exile, or someone placed the prints there after the fact, framed him, or covered their own trail. A false victory, offered up to satisfy the authorities and close the book. Harriet turned the notebook toward him. Mercar mentioned something curious. Here, April 7th. L spoke of changing alliances. T said nothing, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew. They think I don't notice. The house listens. The walls listen, even when no one speaks. The silence is full. Whimsy read the passage, frowning. He knew something was wrong. They were working together, she said. Lydia and Trellis, we suspected as much. But now I wonder, what if Glass was never meant to arrive at all? What if the mere idea of him was used to frighten Mercar into revising the will? And once it was done, once Trellis saw her name in print, she no longer needed Lydia. But Lydia still needed to ensure silence. She couldn't kill Trellis, Whimsy said. Too risky. But she could nudge the investigation toward another suspect. Harriet nodded. Someone who'd been circling the story for months. Someone who had already earned Morcar's fear. Whimsy sat back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling. The wind howled against the chimney like an unanswered cry. They lifted Glass's prints from somewhere. A letter, an old envelope. Perhaps something Moldovan left behind, which means someone inside this house or close to it knew how to get them. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Harriet stood. We need to speak to Lydia. Now. But Lydia was gone. Her room was empty. Her wardrobe half cleared. A small trunk missing. The housekeeper's ledger kept in the kitchen cabinet showed that a call had come through late the previous night, answered by Lydia while the staff slept. The number led to a carriage hire service in York. A driver had picked up a passenger from Greystone at 2 in the morning. Gone, Harriet said, her voice tight. But not far, Whimsy murmured. Not with the storm. She'll be slowed. They stood once more at the edge of something no longer just a crime scene, but the unraveling of a performance, a confession to perfect, a knife to clean, a name to convenient. Outside, the rain pounded the windows, and the sea beyond crashed, like thunder against the cliffs. Somewhere, in a carriage skirting the edges of Yorkshire, Lydia Mercar was slipping between the cracks of a case the world believed already solved. But Harriet Vane and Lord Peter Whimsy knew better. The shadows had not lifted. They were only beginning to deepen. The storm began to ease just after midday, but a lingering dampness clung to Greystone's stone floors and window panes, as though the house itself resented being left behind by the rain. Harriet stood in the library, staring at the empty hearth, her arms folded tightly over her coat. Whimsy was already at the desk, turning over papers with unhurried precision. His brow furrowed. "She's 2 hours ahead of us at best," Harriet said. "She won't head straight for London to Obvious, maybe York, or even across the border. She'll have arranged a safe place," Whimsy replied. "She's too careful to run without a landing spot." He lifted a sheaf of old letters and frowned. "But we're not ready to chase her yet." Harriet crossed to his side. "What is it?" He handed her a yellowed envelope. "From 1930. Addressed to Edwin Ricard. Postmarked Budapest." Harriet read the name scrawled in tight, elegant script. Theris Bakisi. The return address had faded, but the name struck an immediate chord. She glanced at Whimsy, who was already reaching for Morker's journal. "I've seen that name," she said. "So have I." April 3rd entry, Whimsy murmured. He turned the pages until he found it. "Received second letter from TB still insists. It wasn't my fault, but I know it was. I let her take the fall. The girl, she was never found. Glass buried her deeper than the truth." Harriet whispered. "TB Trellis Bethany was a convenient assumption," Whimsy said. "But this is the true origin of those initials in the will. And this girl, someone disappeared, likely in Budapest, and Ricard blamed himself." Harriet lowered herself into the chair. "This isn't just about Lydia, or Glass, or Moldovan. This is older than we thought." They retrieved the rest of the Budapest letters from the false drawer beneath Morker's desk. Dozen, at least, all written in French by the same careful hand. Theris Bakisi had once worked at a clinic with Ricard and Rupert Glass during the late 1920s. There had been a scandal involving the disappearance of a patient, a girl named Lydia Novak, whose body was never recovered. The letters referenced a child with missing records, silent bribes, and most notably, a single repeated phrase, "Ils n'ont jamais henri." They never buried her. She was 17. Harriet said, voice tight. "She went missing after surgery conducted by Glass. Ricard supervised. Theris raised the alarm and was dismissed within the month. And the matter was covered up," Whimsy said grimly. "No charges, no investigation. It was quietly erased. She was trying to reach Ricard all these years," Harriet murmured, flipping through the last letter. "And now," he finally added her initials to the will. "Guilt," Whimsy said. "Not generosity, not affection. Guilt." Harriet looked up. "So Lydia may not be who she says she is." Whimsy blinked. "Go on." "She's not in any birth registry as Morker's niece, and you said yourself he never spoke fondly of her, even to friends. What if she's not his niece at all? A fabricated identity? What if she's Lydia Novak's sister, or cousin, or even her daughter?" Whimsy stared at her for a moment, then rose and crossed to the study door. "We need passenger records, travel papers, anything to prove who Lydia really is." They contacted the Hungarian consulate and requested archival data. In the meantime, Whimsy sent a coded telegram to a contact in MI6 who had occasionally worked with foreign case histories. By the time the answers arrived 2 hours later, over a crackling wire, the outlines of the past had begun to take shape. Lydia Novak's sister, Eva Novak, had left Hungary in 1931 under a forged name. She was 17, alone, and passed through Paris before arriving in Dover under the identity of Lydia Murray. The trail vanished after that until, in 1942, a Lydia Ricard was listed as next of kin in a minor civil claim involving Edwin Morker's estate. She embedded herself, Harriet said, deliberately, patiently. She played the grieving niece, earned just enough of his trust, and waited decades. Whimsy sat down slowly. That explains her silence, her restraint. She didn't want to kill him in a fit of passion. She wanted to ruin him, the way her sister was ruined. She convinced Trellis to help. Maybe she offered money. Maybe she promised justice. And when the will changed, when Glass's name started to surface again, she got nervous. Too many ghosts, and Glass, Whimsy murmured, might have known who she was, or suspected. He could have been her real target, not Ricard, which means if we catch her now, she'll vanish. If she's gone to finish something, it's not over. The telephone rang. Harriet answered and listened quietly, nodding as she took notes. "Yorkshire Constabulary just reported an abandoned carriage," she said. "Passenger vanished. Driver says she paid double to be left at a junction near Kirkful. That's 20 miles from a private sanitarium once managed by Rupert Glass. Whimsy stood. Then that's where she's gone. Not to flee, Harriet said, to finish the story. They were in the car before the hour was out, tires splashing through puddles, headlights cutting tunnels through the fog. The hills loomed high and sodden, and the sanitarium, though abandoned now, still stood against the slope like a scar in stone. Its windows were empty sockets. Its gate rusted open. They entered with torches raised, boots echoing on the tiled floors. The scent of mildew and old antiseptic clung to the air. Whimsy moved with practiced calm, Harriet close behind. In the far west wing where the surgical suites once lay, they found the signs of recent presence. Footprints in the dust, a broken beam used to force a door, and in the operating theater, beneath the shattered overhead lamp, Lydia stood. She did not flinch as they entered. Her coat was soaked, her hair slick with rain, but her eyes were clear, almost eerily calm. "You followed me," she said. "We had to," Harriet replied. Whimsy glanced behind her. In the corner, tied to a rusted pipe, sat a man, filthy, bruised. His mouth gagged. "Rupert Glass. I didn't want to kill him," Lydia said. "I just wanted him to confess, to admit what he did to my sister. But he refused, even now." "Lydia Novak," Harriet said softly. "She was your sister." "Yes." Her voice did not waver. "They buried her without a stone, without a record. He cut her open and called it medicine, and Ricard let it happen. I came to watch them fall, one by one." "And now?" Whimsy asked. She looked at them, her expression unreadable. "That depends," she said, "on whether you believe justice comes before the law or after." The storm had passed, but in that decaying hall of ghosts, the air still trembled with everything that had come before. The past was no longer a shadow. It stood before them, flesh and voice. Wrath made real, rain had turned to mist, curling like breath through the broken windows of the abandoned sanitarium. The silence that followed Lydia's final words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Harriet's fingers tightened on the flashlight as its beam wavered across the floor tiles. Somewhere behind her, Glass let out a muffled grunt beneath the gag. Whimsy didn't move. He merely watched Lydia, his head tilted slightly, as if observing a strange bird that might take flight or strike. "You could have killed him," he said finally. "You had the time, the isolation, no interruptions, and yet here he sits, bruised but alive." "I wanted him to see where it ended," Lydia replied. "Where it all began. This room, the theater of lies." "And then what?" Harriet asked. "Take him to the police? The story's too old. No body, no charge. They'll say you fabricated it, that he's just an old man being hunted by ghosts." Lydia's expression didn't change, but her knuckles whitened on the iron pipe she leaned against. "I don't care what the law says. I know what he did, and so does he. But you still want something," Whimsy said. "Justice, validation, confession, maybe even peace." Lydia hesitated just a flicker. Whimsy's tone lightened, as though switching. "Parlor registers. It's rather like a chess endgame, isn't it? You've sacrificed a great deal, played your rooks with care, but the king still sits on the board. Do you take him now or force a stalemate?" She looked at him warily. "What are you suggesting?" He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "That the final move hasn't been made, and it's not yours to play, not yet." Harriet caught the change in his voice, the slight quickening. She knew him well enough to recognize it. He was laying bait, and whatever he had in mind, it hadn't yet taken form. Whimsy turned suddenly to Glass and knelt by the pipe. He tugged the gag away, and Glass gasped, coughing hard. "You people are mad," he wheezed. "You'll all hang." Whimsy held up a hand and turned to Harriet. "We're wasting time. He's not going to speak, unless—" He stood and looked around theatrically, tapping the flashlight against his palm. "I wonder," he said aloud, "whether Glass knows about the tape." Lydia straightened. "What tape?" Harriet blinked. Whimsy turned to Glass with mild curiosity. "He didn't tell you, did he? Mercar recorded his conversations." "Not all of them, just the important ones. He had a dictaphone in his study, old-fashioned, but it worked. He was paranoid, and in this case, perhaps rightly so." He turned back to Lydia, who now looked uncertain. He kept one particular reel marked only with a red sticker, Whimsy. Went on, I listened to it yesterday. A conversation with a man who came to the house in March. It began in Latin, oddly, before switching to English. Quite a voice, thick, deliberate. And unmistakably yours, Mr. Glass. Glass stared at him, stunned. There's no tape, Harriet whispered, barely moving her lips. Of course there isn't, Whimsy murmured, just as softly. But Glass had swallowed hard. He lied. He said, he told me he destroyed all that, all the Budapest files. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. So he did keep records. I don't know what he kept, Glass snapped. He said the Novak girl was gone, disappeared during recovery. I believed him. I never saw her again. Lydia let out a low sound, sharp and hollow. You believed him? Glass turned to her, face pale. I wasn't the one in charge. I did what I was told. I wasn't even supposed to operate. But Mercar insisted. He said the procedure would be simple. She died, Lydia said. You buried her behind the incinerator. You left her. I never saw the body, Glass cried. He handled it. Mercar handled everything, and just like that, it was done. Harriet exhaled slowly. Lydia's face was ashen. Her composure shattered, not at the admission, but the realization that the story she had built, the one in which Glass had always been the monster, now wavered with uncertainty, not innocence, no, but nuance, complexity, doubt. Whimsy crouched beside Glass again, his voice cool. You know what's extraordinary? You spent all those years hiding from the law, when the law would never have touched you. But a woman's grief, that finds you anywhere. Glass looked away. Lydia was shaking. She dropped the pipe and turned toward the broken window, her shoulders stiff. I don't know what's real anymore. Harriet moved to her side but said nothing. Whimsy rose and dusted off his hands. We'll take him in, he said. Let the court of public opinion do what the justice system won't. But you, Miss Novak, you need to decide whether vengeance was your goal or truth. Lydia didn't answer, but she didn't run again either. Later, back at Greystone, after the authorities had arrived, Harriet poured tea while Whimsy flipped through Morker's final journal again. You never heard the name Therese Bakisi before, did you? She asked. No, but it was her letters that began everything, and one phrase that stuck with me. He turned to the margin where Mercar had written in a shaking hand, Ils n'ont jamais Henri. They never buried her, Harriet repeated. No, Whimsy said. But in the end, they buried everything else, reputations, truth, and nearly justice. And the tape, Whimsy smiled faintly. There wasn't one, of course, but deception. When used to reveal the truth, now that's a shadow worth stepping into. They drank their tea as the wind pressed against the windows once more. But this time, the house didn't seem quite so heavy. Not cleansed, perhaps, but no longer haunted. The morning after the sanitarium ordeal dawned gray and unforgiving. Fog hung low over the fields like a second skin, muffling the world and distorting shape and sound. Greystone Manor, stoic as ever, creaked beneath the weight of rising tension. Though Lydia remained under guard in the village constabulary, neither arrested nor freed, there was no triumph in the air. Whimsy knew better than to trust the momentary quiet. In the library, Harriet sifted through a new box of documents recovered from Morker's attic by the constable's team. Medical files, travel logs, and correspondence dating back 3 decades had been sealed in oilskin and buried beneath a false floorboard. Someone had taken care to hide them, but not to destroy them. That in itself suggested intent. A trail left behind for a time when it might matter. She placed a stack of pages on the table, tapping them once. This changes things. Lydia Novak wasn't the only patient who vanished. 2 others, same clinic, same surgeon. Glass's name appears on both files, but so does Morker's. Whimsy leaned in, brow furrowed. We need these archived and copied securely. I'll take them to Inspector Bartram myself. He nodded but didn't look up. His fingers traced a faint watermark on one of the envelopes, the kind left by long travel through damp air. And the original Ashabdi? I asked Holmwood to keep it at the station under lock, alongside the knife, the will, and the glass correspondence. Then everything rests in that building. Too much, perhaps. Harriet looked at him. You think someone will try to interfere? I think someone already has. It was nearly noon when the call came. Harriet answered, listening without speaking for nearly a full minute. Her eyes narrowed as her fingers tightened around the receiver. When she hung up, her voice was brittle. The evidence vault at the village station was broken into during the night. No signs of forced entry. No alarms triggered. What's missing? The Ashabdi, she said. And the original will. Whimsy said nothing at first. The clock ticked in the background. Polite and oblivious. Someone's trying to rewrite the ending, he murmured. By the time they reached the station, the building was a flurry of activity. Holmwood's face was a storm cloud in uniform. Constables moved with clipped urgency, but the sense of intrusion lingered in the air like ash after a fire. It was an inside job. Holmwood admitted through clenched teeth only 3 keys to that room: mine, Bartram's, and Jenkins's. Jenkins claims his was with him all night. Bartram? Harriet asked. Out sick since yesterday. Fever. He never collected the items from your call. Which leaves your key, Whimsy said gently. I've had it on me the whole time. Harriet stepped forward. Any sign of the thief? Holmwood gestured toward the back room. There's something you should see. They followed him past overturned chairs and scattered documents to the evidence locker. Inside, the room still smelled of dust and metal. The storage boxes had been stacked with care, most untouched. But at the center of the far wall, a cabinet stood open, its interior empty, but for a smear of blackened soot across the lower shelf. Someone burned something, Harriet said. Likely tried to burn the Ashabdi, Holmwood muttered. Didn't succeed. Fire didn't catch properly. But the original will's gone. Any replacements? Whimsy asked. Yes, the amended copy still exists. But now there's no original to compare it against. And glass? Still being held in Newcastle. Under close watch. Whimsy nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. It's not him, not this time. Outside, the fog had begun to lift in streaks, revealing the sharp edges of the village once more. But the air still felt wrong. Whimsy and Harriet walked in silence to the car, gravel crunching beneath their feet. She panicked. Harriet said at last, Lydia must have arranged it, or someone on her behalf. Whimsy shook his head. No, Lydia wouldn't destroy the will. It held her justification. It tied her identity to Makar. It proved his guilt. Then who? He paused by the gate, his eyes narrowing. Trellis. She's in custody. Yes, but not alone. And she had help before. Someone on the inside. Someone who gained access to the records. Perhaps even the Ashabdi itself. Harriet frowned. But the point of burning the Ashabdi escapes me. It's a fake. And it already served its purpose. Exactly, Whimsy said. It served its purpose too well. It drew glass out. It tied the story together. But if the relic vanishes and the will disappears, then what do we have? An accusation with no anchor. A confession that begins to look staged. A niece without proof of kinship. Suddenly, it's not justice, it's vengeance. She exhaled slowly. So someone wants to reduce the story back to shadows, or to control how it ends, he said. Not destroy it. That evening, back at Greystone, Harriet laid out the remaining pieces of correspondence on the long table. Every letter from Therese Bakisi, every note from Makar. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed the edges of the final envelope. It was the only one addressed in a different hand. I missed this before, she said. This wasn't from Therese. It was to her. Whimsy looked up sharply. Harriet unfolded the page. My dear T, I've kept your letters. All of them. What we did cannot be erased. But perhaps it can be understood. If anything happens to me, show them to the girl. Show her where it began. .m.wimsey read it silently. He wanted her to know. Maybe even to forgive. Which is why someone had to stop it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Holmwood stood outside, breathless and pale. We found something, he said, at the back of the evidence room, tucked into the old furnace vent. He held out a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside, half burned, the Ashabdi lay cracked, but intact, its base scorched, but the etched symbols still faintly visible. Next to it, a charred scrap of paper blackened, but legible enough to see the words, hereby named TB as beneficiary. Not enough for court, But enough for truth. Whimsy took the relic carefully. Someone tried to erase history, he said. But fire only deepens its scars, and outside, the fog dissolved at last into cold, clean light. The early frost had begun to melt when the second call came short, breathless, urgent. Harriet answered, and Whimsy watched from the opposite chair as her face stiffened. Then went eerily still. That was Homewood, she said, hanging up. Trellis Bethany's gone. Whimsy stood, slowly. Gone how? She escaped. The nurse found her bed empty during morning rounds. Window forced. No prints, no note. She was under guard. They think someone helped her. Whimsy turned away, walking to the fire that had burned low in the grate. He watched the coals shift, red and patient. This wasn't panic, he murmured. This was planned. She wouldn't run unless she had somewhere to run to. He nodded slowly, or someone to protect her. Neither of them said it aloud, but the idea hovered like mist. The evidence vault compromised. The Ashabdi nearly destroyed. The will reduced to ash. A staged confession, just convincing enough to be doubted. And now a witness-turned accomplice gone missing exactly when she mattered most. By noon they were at the station again. Holmwood led them straight to the infirmary. The window had been forced from the inside, but what chilled Harriet was the folded page left on the pillow. Whimsy opened it delicately, typed, unsigned, no greeting. Just a message, you've come far, but not far enough. Greystone holds more than memory. If you want truth, look where the dead don't rest. Harriet's brow furrowed. A riddle, or a warning, or both, Whimsy said. Greystone. It always comes back to that house. Where the dead don't rest, Harriet echoed. What does that mean? Whimsy folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. Morker's secrets weren't only buried in letters. They were buried in rooms, in rituals, in what was never said. The drive back to the manor was swift, silent. The sky hung low, clouds swollen with unspoken threat. At Greystone, the housekeeper met them at the door, pale and shaken. I didn't know if I should disturb it, she whispered. But something's wrong in the east wing. They followed her down the corridor, past shuttered doors and faded portraits. The east wing had been closed for years and used since Morker's health had declined. The air was cold there, stale with disuse. It was the scent that reached them first, acrid, chemical, artificial. Beneath it, something darker, older. The door to Morker's original bedroom stood ajar. Inside, the furniture had been dragged away from the walls. The wallpaper near the hearth had been slashed, exposing the wood and plaster beneath. And on the floor, in a perfect circle of disturbed dust, lay a single red candle burned low, still faintly warm. Harriet bent to examine the scorched floorboards. Someone performed something here, a ritual, a distraction. Whimsy crossed to the fireplace, running his hands along the inside frame. Then he stopped, knelt, and pressed gently at a spot just above the grate. A click, then a slow groan of hinges. The panel slid open to reveal a narrow compartment behind the hearth. Inside was a box. They stared for a moment before Harriet reached in and lifted it free. Wood, mahogany, bound with brass, a crest on the lid. Morker's family seal, half worn by time. She opened it. Inside were photographs, brittle and curled at the edges. Women young, pale, unsmiling, posed stiffly beside clinical instruments. Handwritten names beneath each: L. Novak, M. Yanek, E. Roebuck. Medical notations, some bearing Morker's signature, others Rupert Glass's. Below the photographs, wrapped in silk, was a single scalpel, tarnished, its blade dull with age. The initials L.N. etched into the handle. Harriet swallowed. He kept souvenirs. He kept trophies. Whimsy corrected, proof of what they did, or what he let happen. She looked down at the names again. There are more than we knew. This box, he said, is everything Lydia was trying to find, everything Therese tried to warn him about, and everything someone now wants to erase. They returned to the library with the box, locking it in the safe behind the portrait of Morker's grandfather. Harriet logged every item, photographing each before securing the originals. The house was silent except for the hiss of the wind outside. But just as Whimsy turned to close the curtains, something caught his eye through the frost-laced glass. A figure. Tall, pale coat, walking the perimeter of the lawn, deliberate, slow, circling the house. He didn't shout. Instead, he turned to Harriet with a calm that belied the tension in his chest. "Stay here." He stepped out into the cold, crunching across the gravel in long strides. But by the time he reached the edge of the garden, the figure had vanished behind the trees. Only footprints in the frost remained, long, measured, leading away toward the forest. He followed. The path was uneven, winding down toward the old gardener's shed. The structure had collapsed years ago, left to rot beneath ivy and wet moss. But the door now hung open. He approached slowly. Inside, moonlight filtered through broken slats. Tools lay scattered, and in the far corner motionless was a body. He stepped closer, breath catching. It was Constable Jenkins, throat cut, blood soaked into the earth beneath him, still fresh, pinned to his chest with a nail. Another note: truth is not enough. Silence dies harder. By the time Harriet reached him, he was already kneeling beside the body, jaw set, eyes colder than she'd seen in days. "He helped Trellis escape," he said. "She didn't do it alone." He let her in, gave her the keys, and tried to wipe the evidence clean. But someone didn't like his work. "No," Whimsy said softly. "Someone thought he knew too much." She looked at the note. "It's not just revenge anymore." "No." He agreed. "It's a war of endings." And in that moment, with the wind rustling through the trees like a whisper of judgment, Harriet realized that their adversary, whoever they were, had been watching all along. Not just reacting, orchestrating. They stood in silence for a long moment beside Jenkins's body, the frost hardening around the blood-soaked ground, turning horror into something eerily pristine. The note, pinned crudely to the constable's chest, fluttered faintly in the breeze, as though mocking them with its riddled finality. Harriet turned to Whimsy, her voice low. Someone wanted him silenced, but not just silenced, shamed. They left him like a message or a warning, Whimsy replied, still crouched beside the corpse. His eyes swept the small shed again, not for threats those had already passed, but for meaning, for something he might have missed. There were the usual tools, rusted and long disused, a stack of old flower pots in the corner, bags of lime and soil, and a single object resting on the overturned workbench near the wall, a pocket watch, gold, cracked down the face, still ticking. He picked it up, studied the engraving inside the lid. "To J. From M. Mercar gave him this," Whimsy said. "Jenkins wasn't just an accomplice, he was loyal. He's been watching this house longer than we realized." "Which means," Harriet said slowly, "he knew what was hidden in the fireplace compartment before we found it. And perhaps even more." Whimsy murmured, "Perhaps he knew who else was watching." They returned to Greystone as the sun began its slow decline. Inside, the manor felt colder than ever, the old pipes clicking behind the walls like restless bones. Harriet made tea out of habit, but neither touched it. Whimsy took the box from the safe again and spread the photos and letters out across the long library table, as though laying cards in a game that had only now begun to reveal its rules. "Let's walk back through it," he said. "Every choice, every reaction." Lydia pursued the truth. Glass ran. Jenkins played both sides. Trellis escaped, likely with help. Mercar buried the past until just before his death. Why? Harriet studied the documents. Maybe he wanted to confess without suffering the consequences. The altered will, the Ashabdi, the letters to Theris. They all feel like guilt, not redemption, or a trap, Whimsy added. He left the pieces scattered. But what if he didn't want them assembled? She looked at him. "You think he knew it would draw someone out?" "I think Mercar didn't fear exposure. He feared someone else finding what he'd hidden." A soft sound interrupted them, a slow creak from the drawing room. At the end of the hall, they exchanged a glance, rose silently. Whimsy motioned Harriet behind him as he approached the doorway. The room was empty, but on the far windowsill, a shutter rocked gently on its hinge. The latch had been undone from the outside. Harriet crossed to it. Whoever it was, they didn't come to kill. "No," Whimsy said. "They came to look." He returned to the photos, eyes narrowing. He sorted through the stack until he reached one of the earlier prints, the youngest of the girls. Face shadowed by poor exposure, He held it to the light, then frowned. "This image," he said. I've seen this before." Harriet came to his side. "Where?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he turned and crossed to the bookshelf on the west wall, reached behind a row of medical texts, and drew out a leather-bound volume with a gold spine. Morker's personal album. They had flipped through it once before, days ago. But now, whimsy paged to the middle photos from a 1931 conference in Vienna, then Budapest, Morker shaking hands with foreign colleagues, standing stiffly beside ornate buildings, and in one frame an exhibit hall crowded with attendees. A tall woman stood in the background, partially obscured, her face turned, but in her arms, a small child. Whimsy stared. "This isn't a conference photo. It's a surveillance image." Harriet leaned in. "The woman. That's Therese." He nodded. "And the child. That must be Lydia." Harriet blinked. "But she claims she came to England at 17. She lied," Whimsy said. "Or someone lied for her. She's older. This puts her in Budapest around 1931. Harriet stepped back. "Wait, if that's true, then Lydia isn't the sister of Lydia Novak. She's the daughter." "No," Whimsy said slowly. "That's what we assumed. But look at the ages. Lydia would have been 5, maybe 6. Lydia Novak vanished in 1930. Therese was dismissed. She disappeared shortly after. The girl we thought was Lydia Morker may not be Novak's daughter or even a Novak." Harriet's eyes widened. "She's Therese Bakisi's daughter. And Morker's," Whimsy said softly. "That's why he protected her. Why he changed the will. Why the initials TB meant more than anyone guessed." Harriet stared at him. He hid his own child, hid her identity, gave her a new one, and buried the rest. Whimsy sat down again, the weight of it settling in. Therese must have died shortly after that photo, or was sent away. But Lydia remained, raised in the shadow of lies, trained to believe perhaps truly that she was someone else, that she deserved revenge. Which means this isn't just justice for her mother's death, it's identity reclamation. And that, Whimsy said, tapping the edge of the photo, means she's not done. They sat in silence, the implications unraveling across the room like smoke. A pattern had begun to form, not of motive, but of inheritance. The past had not merely been buried. It had been rewritten, and someone had taken great pains to ensure the version that survived served their purpose. And now, with Trellis free, Jenkins dead, and Lydia's true lineage revealed, Whimsy saw it clearly at last. This was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of another one, authored not by Morker, nor by Glass. But by someone else. Someone who had always been just beyond reach. Night fell slowly over Greystone, casting long shadows across the manor's windows, like the stretched fingers of something long buried, reaching for the warmth of light. Whimsy remained at the library table, unmoving for some time. The photo of Therese and the child opened before him, as if the faint image could speak if only stared at long enough. Harriet paced slowly across the carpet, her brow drawn in thought. "It always felt too personal," she said, almost to herself. "Not just revenge, not even justice. There was a ritual to it, a sense of inheritance. Lydia didn't merely want the truth exposed, she wanted it performed, because it wasn't just a case." Whimsy said, "It was a legacy." He rose, crossed to the fireplace again, and stared into the charred hearth where the hidden box had been found. Therese knew. She may have raised Lydia herself under another name, prepared her, fed her the letters, the fragments, and Morker. He let it happen. Harriet turned to him. But why? Why not stop it? He had power, money. He could have buried it all properly. Whimsy's voice dropped. Because he loved Therese, or because he feared her. Either way, her absence consumed him. He didn't suppress the past out of guilt. He preserved it, ritualized it, because she demanded remembrance and he could never give her peace. Harriet frowned. So he left Lydia the clues, the will, the Ashabdi. As what? A penance? No, Whimsy said, as an inheritance, but one laced with poison. He gave her a story soaked in grief and obsession, and she made it her truth. He returned to the album, flipping past the Vienna photos until he reached the final page, a single slip of paper, pasted in crookedly, a typewritten quote, The dead cannot punish the living, so they find successors who will. Harriet read it over his shoulder. That's not from Mercar. That's from Beckesy's thesis. The Psychology of Transference in Trauma Inheritance. Whimsy nodded slowly. She trained Lydia to become her executioner. And Mercar, he consented. Not to justice but to martyrdom. But someone else has been pulling the strings now. Harriet reminded him. Trellis, Jenkins, the vanishing. Evidence, the murder. Lydia may be part of it, but there's another player. Whimsy turned back to the table, surveying the fragments of testimony, evidence, and memory. There's one person who benefits from all of it, but whose presence has barely been felt. He reached into the file Harriet had logged earlier and pulled free an envelope, a letter dated 8 months prior from a solicitor in Prague, addressed not to Lydia, nor to Mercar but to Rupert Glass. Harriet blinked. He never mentioned this. Whimsy read aloud, voice tight, as executor of Dr. E. Morker's foreign estates. I write to confirm the transfer of title to the sanatorium of St. Agnes to your name, as per the contingency clause activated by his death and the absence of a surviving heir listed under bloodline statute. Harriet's eyes widened. He inherited the clinic through a clause Mercar buried in legalese, a fallback. If Lydia's identity was ever disputed, or erased, ownership would pass to the last attending physician of record. That was Glass. Harriet said nothing for a moment. So if someone erased the will, Whimsy nodded. Glass would benefit immensely. The clinic's land is worth millions now. He stood to gain everything but only if Lydia was discredited and her inheritance vanished. But Glass didn't murder Jenkins. No, Whimsy said. He wasn't smart enough to manage the timing. The messaging, that was someone else, someone who knew Glass would run, that Lydia would pursue, and that we inevitably would dig. Someone who could stay in the margins while we hunted ghosts. Harriet's eyes narrowed. Trellis, Whimsy exhaled slowly. She wasn't a victim. She was the architect. They sat in silence again, the air thick with realization. Trellis posed as a patient at the clinic under a false name. Harriet said slowly, got close to Lydia, close enough to manipulate her memories, her grief. When Mercar died, she re-emerged, helped Lydia believe in the narrative, even fed her the forged will and the Ashabdi. But once the investigation turned serious, she began pruning the tree. Jenkins, Glass, anyone who could muddy the story. She was never trying to protect Lydia, Whimsy said. She was refining her, honing her, like a weapon. But for what? Harriet asked. Power, money? She doesn't inherit anything. Whimsy shook his head. No, but she inherits control. He rose and moved to the bookshelf again, pulling out Beckesy's thesis translated and annotated by Mercar himself. Inside the cover, a dedication to the ones who remember for us. He turned to a bookmarked page. There are those whose trauma consumes them, but the truly dangerous are those who consume the trauma itself, who reshape it, direct it, and pass it forward like a torch. Harriet stared at the words. Trellis wasn't just Lydia's handler. She's Beckesy's disciple. Maybe even her daughter. No, Whimsy said, voice barely above a whisper. She's her replacement. He looked at Harriet, expression dark. Trellis knew everything, and she used everyone. She wanted to finish what Beckesy started, not to punish Mercar, but to institutionalize a philosophy, to create a new class of justice, outside law and memory. Harriet's breath caught. And now she's loose. With Lydia still believing she's the chosen heir to vengeance, Whimsy stepped back from the table, his voice hardening. This isn't about one crime. It never was. It's about passing pain from generation to generation and calling it purpose. Harriet's voice trembled. And unless we stop her, Trellis will find someone else to carry it. Whimsy looked toward the dark window, the silhouette of the forest trembling under the wind. She already has. The night was cold and still, the manor's silhouette etched sharply against a moonless sky. Whimsy and Harriet moved through the corridors with measured steps, the heavy oak doors closing softly behind them. Every creak and whisper in the ancient walls seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. After days of unraveling threads, they had come to a single, inevitable conclusion. Trellis Bethany would be at Greystone before dawn. They had prepared The library was empty except for 2 chairs facing the hearth, a single lantern casting flickering light between them. On the table lay the assembled evidence, photographs, letters, and the Ashabdi locked safely away. The room was a cage, but also a stage. Harriet checked the bolt on the door, then turned to Whimsy. "Are you certain this will work?" He smiled, a faint glint of steel in his eyes. "Only one way to find out. She believes she is still in control. We'll see how she handles the illusion of power." They waited, the clock ticking down the final moments before the trap would close. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the faintest sound came from the east wing. The soft click of a latch, then slow footsteps padding through the hall. Harriet slipped into the shadow by the doorway as Whimsy rose to meet their visitor. The door opened, and Trellis Bethany entered, pale and composed. Her eyes scanned the room, sharp and calculating. But beneath the cool veneer was something deeper, something worn and fierce. "So, Whimsy," she said, voice low but steady, "you've been busy." "I have," he replied evenly, "and I'm grateful you came." She glanced toward Harriet, then back. "You think you've unraveled my web? That you've caught me in your little net?" "Not caught." "No," Whimsy said. "But I do have the advantage of knowing your story." She laughed softly, a sound edged with bitterness. "My story? You think you know it better than I?" He gestured toward the table. "You taught me a great deal, Trellis, about transference, trauma, the legacies we inherit and the ones we choose to pass on." She stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "You speak like a prophet, but you don't understand. This isn't vengeance. This is evolution. Evolution at the cost of innocent lives," Harriet said. Emerging from the shadows, Jenkins, Morker's secrets, Lydia's stolen identity, the burned evidence. You orchestrated it all. Trellis's face hardened. "Lydia was always the key. She is the vessel for a new justice, one unbound by law or history. You can't stop what has already begun." Whimsy folded his hands calmly. "Except, of course, that you've made a critical error. You underestimated us and overestimated your control." Trellis's gaze flickered. "Control is an illusion. The past controls us all, whether we accept it or not." "Then why the charade? Why the murders, the thefts?" Harriet pressed. "You could have hidden in the shadows forever." She smiled, cold and resigned. "Because truth without consequence is meaningless. Because the pain must be seen to be wielded." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession settling like dust. Then, unexpectedly, Trellis lunged swift and desperate toward the door. Whimsy was quicker. With a practiced movement, he intercepted her, grasping her wrist. "You won't escape this." She struggled, fury blazing in her eyes, but Harriet stepped forward, pressing the old iron handcuffs into place with a satisfying click. Breathing hard, Trellis sagged against the table. "You think this ends here? It ends the way all lies do," Whimsy said softly, "in the truth." As dawn crept through the windows, bathing Greystone in pale light, the manor felt lighter, somehow freed from the long shadows that had haunted it. Lydia, now safe and freed from Trellis's influence, would finally have the chance to reclaim her identity, not as a weapon forged by trauma, but as a person in her own right. Whimsy and Harriet stood together, the dawn breaking behind them, knowing the long journey was over, for now. The light of morning filtered softly through the high windows of Greystone, and for the first time in weeks, it seemed to warm rather than accuse. Trellis Bethany had been taken into custody at dawn, silent but composed, her wrists bound and head held high. The calm with which she walked to the waiting car disturbed Harriet more than anything, as if this, too, had been a part of her design. Inside the manor, the library bore the scattered remnants of the case photographs, notes, the scorched remains of the forged will, all now tagged and documented. Lydia sat curled in one of the armchairs, staring into the unlit hearth with a blankness that could not be called peace. Harriet brought her tea, but the cup went untouched. "She'll need time," Harriet said softly, stepping back to where Whimsy stood near the shelves. "Whatever happens now, she's lost everything she believed she was avenging. She's also free of it," Whimsy replied. "For the first time, she can live without someone else's ghost in her ear." They stood together for a quiet moment, the echo of the investigation still settling into silence. But it was too quiet. Whimsy frowned. "Where's the Ashabdi?" Harriet glanced toward the display box on the table. The artifact, the tiny black figurine that had survived so many near destructions, was gone. She turned back to the hallway. Suddenly alert, Whimsy was logged with the officers. "No, I locked it back here myself." No one else was in the room, except Lydia. They both turned toward the hearth. But the chair was empty now. The corridor outside stood open, the faint sound of footsteps just beyond reach. Whimsy moved quickly, silent on the wooden floors, Harriet beside him. They followed the path out into the gallery, then up the eastern stairs, the unused wing of gray stone, its dust disturbed only recently, at the far end. The door to Morker's old study hung ajar. Inside, Lydia stood facing the tall window, the Ashabdi cradled in her hands. "Lydia," Harriet said carefully, "why did you take it?" She didn't turn. "It doesn't belong in a file or a box. It was never evidence. It was the only truth he left me." Whimsy stepped forward, voice gentle. "The Ashabdi was a symbol." "Lydia, but symbols can be replaced. Lives can't." "No," she said softly, but the edge in her voice returned. "That's why I needed to be sure." She turned to face them, and in her eyes was something sharp, calculating, alive. "I remember now. Not everything, but enough. Trellis told me I was a tool, but she wasn't the one who made me." Whimsy's breath caught. "What are you saying?" She lied, Lydia said, voice trembling. "About Bakisi, about her mother, even about me." Harriet stepped closer. "Then who was she?" "She wasn't Bakisi's successor," Lydia whispered. "She was Morker's." The silence in the room turned dense. Whimsy's voice came slow and cautious. "Explain." "She was his nurse," Lydia said, the words falling like stones. "Years ago, before the clinic, before me. She changed her name when she reappeared. But I remember the way she used to hum when he was ill, when she thought I was asleep." Harriet's eyes widened. She wasn't his enemy. She was his disciple. She believed in what he did. The experiments, the manipulation. She helped him hide it. And when he began to fear exposure, she turned on him, not to stop him, but to preserve the work, to carry it forward. Whimsy stood very still. "And what about you?" "I was the bait," Lydia said. "The legacy. She shaped me to hate him just enough to become the story she needed. She never wanted justice, she wanted a clean successor." Whimsy's gaze darkened. "But if Trellis was Morker's protege, then the real mastermind wasn't the man we thought we were unmasking." "No," Lydia said. "Morker wasn't the tyrant she made him out to be. He was weak, controlled, guilty, yes, but not the architect. Trellis manipulated them all. Bakisi, Morker, even me. The entire case was her creation, her final experiment." Harriet swallowed hard. "Then what now?" Lydia walked to the fireplace and knelt, placing the Ashabdi into the cold ashes. "She'll try to rewrite everything, even from prison," she said. "She kept copies. Not just the letters, but notes, journals, audio recordings." "Where?" Whimsy asked, stepping closer. Lydia rose slowly. "In the cellar beneath St. Agnes. The abandoned wing." He exhaled. "Then we end this where it began." Harriet looked between them. "What if it's a trap?" Lydia's smile was bitter. "It probably is. But now you have the truth. That's more dangerous to her than anything." Whimsy glanced out the tall window, where the morning fog curled low over the trees, cloaking the world in shadow. "We've been playing her game since the first day. It's time we changed the rules." As they turned to leave, the Ashabdi sat nestled in the soot, silent but watching, as if it too had been waiting for this final revelation. For the first time, the case no longer looked like a puzzle with a single solution, but a mirror, reflecting every false narrative back into the darkness that birthed it. And somewhere, deep beneath the crumbling stones of St. Agnes, the real story waited to be unearthed. It took less than a day to arrange it, the quiet return to the ruins of St. Agnes, the shuttered sanatorium outside Prague, where the first thread of the conspiracy had been spun and then buried, officially. The authorities were still processing Trellis Bethany's confession and the overwhelming evidence amassed against her, but Whimsy knew better than to wait. Trellis's mind didn't belong to time or process, it moved in patterns, rituals. If she'd left anything behind, It would be sealed in the very heart of her history. The building had the feel of a mausoleum, stripped and hushed as though, where it had once housed too many ghosts to ever welcome the living. The corridors were lined with peeling paint and rusting gurneys, and the only sound was the faint echo of their footsteps and the distant caw of a bird circling the roof. Whimsy, Harriet, and Lydia moved in silence, down past the disused wards and into the lower levels where records had once been stored. It was Lydia who found the door first, hidden behind a collapsed shelf and sealed with a lock too modern for a place so old. She came here often, Lydia said quietly, crouching to examine the latch. I thought it was part of her ritual. I never questioned it. Harriet touched her shoulder. Because she made you trust her. That's what they do. The lock clicked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and cold. It was a long, narrow room, its walls lined with filing cabinets, metal shelves, and old tape reels labeled in neat handwriting. Clinical and methodical. At the far end stood a desk, and atop it, a journal bound in cracked red leather. Whimsy opened it carefully, thumbing through pages filled with Trellis's exacting notes. It wasn't just a confession. It was a doctrine. The pages chronicled every manipulation, every phase of the plan, the manufactured identity for Lydia, the pressure on Jenkins, the deal with Glass. Even Morker's slow unraveling, recorded like a laboratory subject, not a human being. It was not the record of a criminal. It was the scripture of a zealot. This is what she wanted preserved, Whimsy said. Not power, not even revenge, but the blueprint. For others, Lydia stepped away, hands trembling. So it never ends, not unless we end it now, he said, gathering the journals, the tapes, every record they could find. They packed it into boxes and carried them up in silence, sunlight slanting into the upper corridor as if the building itself was beginning to breathe again. The following days moved quickly. The material was handed over to Interpol, the press, cautiously briefed, and Trellis formally charged in connection to multiple crimes across 3 countries. Her composure never cracked. In every courtroom appearance, she remained serene, almost amused, as though her plan had worked in some deeper way they had not yet grasped. And then, 3 weeks later, on the eve of her extradition to Hungary, she vanished. The official report cited an administrative oversight during a transfer at a holding facility in Austria. The guard on duty, whose real identity turned out to be an alias, disappeared with her. No sign, no message, no claim of responsibility, just absence. Clean, surgical, like a stitch pulled from a seam. Harriet stared at the report in stunned silence. She was always playing the long game. Lydia didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was hollow. She left enough behind to haunt the world for years, even if she's never found. Whimsy closed the file gently. Then it's up to us to ensure the world doesn't fall for her myth. They returned to Greystone that evening. The manor was quiet again. The weight of its secrets lifted, but the scars would linger. Lydia stayed on for a while, walking the gardens each morning in silence, relearning the land without the shadows. Eventually she left, quietly, leaving behind a note with no forwarding address. Weeks passed. Then one morning, Harriet entered the library to find Whimsy seated at the hearth, a single photograph laid before him. It was one of the older ones, an image of the girls at the clinic, taken years before. In the background, a mirror reflected a blurred figure holding a camera. Harriet leaned in. That's not Mercar. Whimsy nodded. No, it's Trellis. She was watching from the very beginning. Harriet exhaled. We thought we were unraveling a mystery, but we were walking a path she built for us. She built it well, Whimsy said. But she forgot one thing. Harriet looked at him. Paths don't always lead where their makers intend, he said. Sometimes someone takes a step off it. Harriet smiled faintly, and when they do, Whimsy folded the photo, placed it into the fire, and watched it curl to ash. That's when the story changes. The flames flickered and rose, and for a moment, the library glowed with a strange warmth, like the closing of a chapter long overdue. The case had not ended with triumph or total justice, but with a reckoning. And though the villain had escaped, the illusion of their control had not. In the end, that was enough. For now. Rain fell in soft sheets across the gravel path leading from Greystone, muting the world in gray and silver. Lord Peter Wimsey walked slowly, his coat collar turned up against the wind, the hem already damp with dew. The house behind him loomed like a quiet sentinel, no longer haunted, but never quite empty of the things it had seen. Harriet met him at the gate, umbrella in hand. "You left without breakfast again," she said with a half smile. "That's how I know your mind hasn't let it go." He gave a non-committal hum, brushing a gloved hand along the iron bars. "It should be done. The evidence catalogued, the case wrapped, the press has moved on, and Interpol's off chasing shadows in Montenegro." "But," she prompted, walking beside him as they made their way toward the edge of the estate. Wimsey paused beneath an old elm whose branches strained toward the sky. "There's something I keep returning to. Not just the vanishing, not just how Trellis escaped, but why she chose that moment. She didn't plan the extradition delay, no, but she counted on one happening. That's what troubles me. Everything else she orchestrated with surgical precision except her own disappearance. That she left to chance?" Harriet tilted her head. "You think someone helped her more than the guard?" "I think someone was always helping her. Not for loyalty, but leverage." He turned to her. "There's a report I requested from Prague, a record of the St. Agnes Foundation's private endowments. I only got the translated portion 2 days ago." She raised a brow. "And 2 months before Mercar died, an anonymous donation was made to a shell company connected to a biotech firm in Switzerland. The same firm Trellis was linked 2 years ago when she vanished from the official record. That can't be a coincidence. No, it's a connection, but one buried under years of plausible deniability and forged names." Harriet glanced down the muddy path. "So there's someone else behind her?" "Not behind," Wimsey said slowly. "Alongside. Perhaps someone who never left the clinic's orbit. Someone who believed, just as she did, that trauma could be wielded." They continued in silence for a while, the rain softening into mist. A robin darted from the hedgerow, briefly shattering the gray stillness with the flash of red. "Do you think she'll ever resurface?" Harriet asked. Wimsey considered. "If she does, it won't be with a gun or a threat. It'll be with a story, another orphan, another shattered past. And by the time we realize she's at the center of it, we'll already be 3 moves behind." They reached the old stone wall bordering the estate, where ivy clung like memory. Wimsey reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in linen, small, heavy. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal the Ashabdi. "I thought we left it in the ashes," Harriet said quietly. "We did," Wimsey replied, "or we thought we had. But this one turned up in a shipment to the British Museum last week. No note. Just a tag, returned to sender." She frowned. "A message or a challenge?" He said, "There's one more thing." He passed her a photograph, an old one, yellowed at the corners. It was the group from the Vienna conference, where Mercar, Bakisi, and Trellis had once stood among a sea of physicians. But this copy had a name scrawled faintly on the back. Dr. Charles Fenner. Harriet blinked. "He wasn't in the file." "No," Wimsey said. "He wasn't mentioned at all. But I traced the name to a clinic in Lyon. Quiet, private, focused on experimental narrative therapy, financed by a company linked to the same biotech shell that funded St. Agnes." He watched as her eyes widened, her breath caught somewhere between realization and disbelief. "You think he's the architect?" "I think he was the quiet one," Wimsey said. "The kind who never gets arrested, never leaves fingerprints, never appears in photographs until long after the frame has been examined, but always there, always listening." Harriet shook her head slowly. "So it isn't over?" "No," he said. "Not entirely. We pulled one thread from a tapestry, but the weaving continues somewhere else." They stood for a moment at the wall, the landscape stretching before them into the pale distance, fields fading into mist. Wimsey tucked the Ashabdi back into the cloth. "We'll be ready next time." Harriet looked at him. "You always say that." He gave a tired smile. "And one day, I'll even believe it." They turned back toward the manor, walking side by side beneath the trees. Behind them, in the branches of the elm, a small scrap of cloth fluttered, a fragment of linen, tied in a knot, barely visible unless one knew to look. Wimsey paused. His eyes met Harriet's. Was that there before? She followed his gaze, shook her head. He didn't move to touch it, didn't need to. He turned away. The past, after all, was never done with anyone. It simply waited, patient and silent, for the next detective to come walking its path.